The winter of 1941 had descended over the Russian front with a merciless hand. Soldiers trudged through the snow, their boots sinking into a frozen wasteland, breath rising in ragged clouds that disappeared into the icy fog. The Germans had come with the arrogance of victory, confident their blitzkrieg would crush the Soviets before frost could bite. But frost had its own designs. Engines froze, rifles jammed, and soldiers' fingers and toes blackened with frostbite before they could even fire a shot. Entire columns stalled on frozen rivers, and tanks, proud beasts of war, sank helplessly into the ice. The Soviets, wrapped in thick furs and knowing the land, watched with grim satisfaction as the invaders struggled. They moved with patience, striking where the terrain favored them, letting the winter bleed the Germans dry before bullets even had a chance. By the summer of 1944, the Allies faced a different but equally formidable opponent: the weather over the English Channel. Clouds thick with storm winds rolled across the sea, tossing landing crafts and shivering men as the invasion of Normandy loomed. Soldiers huddled together, soaked through, seasickness making the hours feel endless. In dimly lit war rooms, generals pored over weather reports, their faces grim as reports of heavy tides and violent storms forced a postponement of the D-Day landings. Every man aboard those crafts knew that timing was everything, and yet the sea seemed determined to delay them. When the storm finally relented, the invasion began. Waves crashed over landing crafts, men were thrown into the freezing water, yet they pressed forward, driven by courage and the sheer necessity of survival. The beaches of Normandy were chaos incarnate, and yet, somehow, footholds were gained. Soldiers would later remember not just the enemy, but the wind, the rain, the tides that had tested them at every step. Later that year, the Ardennes forest lay blanketed in a dense fog, and the Battle of the Bulge commenced with an eerie silence. Visibility dropped to mere meters, and American soldiers moved cautiously, rifles damp with condensation, hearts hammering at every unexpected sound. German tanks emerged suddenly, silhouettes through the mist, their engines growling like predators. Soldiers fired blindly, shouted directions, and scrambled for cover. The weather had become both shield and obstacle. Allied aircraft, grounded by clouds, could not provide support, leaving the troops exposed. Yet, when the skies finally cleared, the tide turned. Bombers ripped through enemy formations and the fog of confusion lifted. The battle had been won not only by bravery and strategy, but by a delicate interplay with forces beyond human control. In the Pacific, the stormy season brought its own trials. Typhoons lashed at naval fleets, tossing ships like toys on the open sea. Landing operations on distant islands were delayed, supplies ruined by sudden deluges, men swept into the water before they even reached the beaches. Those who survived learned to move with the weather, timing their attacks with the lull between storms, turning nature's fury into an unlikely ally. Even in the Mediterranean, rain turned the hills of Italy into quagmires. Tanks floundered in mud, artillery bogged down, and soldiers' progress slowed to a crawl. Every movement became a negotiation with wind, water, and earth, a constant reminder that the battlefield extended beyond human adversaries. Through all of it, weather shaped the course of the war as much as any general or soldier. It claimed lives, dictated strategy, and forced men and women to adapt in ways they had never imagined. Some froze in the Russian tundra. Some drowned in storm-tossed waves. Some struggled blindly through fog and mud. Yet all endured, and through that endurance, the tide of history slowly shifted. The wind, the rain, the snow, they were silent participants in the war, impartial but relentless, shaping heroism, tragedy, and the very fate of nations. The Russian winter of 1941 lingered longer than anyone had anticipated. Lieutenant Krauss had learned quickly that no amount of training could prepare a man for the brutal combination of snow, mud, and frozen despair. His fingers, swollen and blackened from frostbite, refused to manipulate the buttons on his radio. Each morning he woke with an ache in his chest, the cold gnawing through his wool coat as if it were paper. Around him, men fell ill, their bodies succumbing not to bullets, but to hypothermia and exhaustion. Supplies, delayed by frozen roads, became almost mythical in value. One day, Krauss watched as a column of trucks, laden with fuel, sank into a river that had frozen unevenly. The ice cracked under the weight, plunging diesel and men into water that smelled of oil and death. The soldiers of the Red Army, in contrast, moved with a patience born of intimate knowledge of the land and climate. Sergeant Ivan Petrov adjusted his scarf over his mouth and nose, moving silently through the snowdrifts with his unit. Each footprint in the snow was a trap for the enemy, each tree a vantage point. He laughed softly as he watched German soldiers struggle with their rifles, the lubricants having frozen solid. "They come with pride," he muttered to his comrades. "But winter will teach them humility." Days later, when Krauss's battalion tried to advance along a frozen road, Petrov's men set hidden anti-tank obstacles beneath fresh snow. The first tank struck, shattering ice and sending shrapnel into the cold sky. It was not the Russians who struck hardest. It was the weather, the snow, and the frost that weakened the Germans, leaving them vulnerable to even a small, calculated attack. By spring, the German army had not advanced far from the borders of Moscow. Krauss's battalion was a ghost of itself, with men who could barely stand, tanks that refused to move, and a general staff frustrated by delays they could neither understand nor control. Orders were sent, ignored, or simply unexecutable. He remembered a single morning when the sun rose over a landscape of frozen trees, the sky pink and cruelly beautiful. Krauss stared at it, feeling the futility of human arrogance against the sheer force of nature. Somewhere in that frozen expanse, the Soviets moved, survived, and endured while the Germans froze. Years later, when Krauss would tell this story, he would remember not the bullets or the explosions, but the silence between them. The crack of frozen ground underfoot, the whistle of wind through bare trees, the icy bite on a man's skin that seemed to mock the very idea of an invincible army. In Western Europe, 1944 brought different weather challenges, equally deadly in their unpredictability. On June 5th, the night before D-Day, the English Channel churned violently under the weight of storms. Soldiers in landing crafts were thrown against each other, the waves crashing over the bows, drenching men in icy salt water. Private James Harris vomited over the side for the third time that night, the cold seeping into his bones, making even the act of gripping the sides of the craft an effort. Around him, men whispered prayers, swore curses, or simply stared at the dark horizon. Waiting, in the war room in Southwick House, General Eisenhower's hands shook slightly as he read the reports from meteorologists. He had planned for a dawn landing, clear skies, and a gentle tide. But the storm had arrived uninvited, a chaotic partner in the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. Each man knew that weather could kill just as certainly as the German fortifications along the coast. The invasion, he realized, could not begin. Every hour of delay increased anxiety, threatened morale, and yet every hour of calm was a narrow window of opportunity. By the morning of June the 6th, the storm had passed enough to allow the landing. Soldiers pushed through waves that slapped them like whips. Landing crafts struck the beaches at impossible angles, throwing men into sand and surf alike. Harris finally reached the shore, his uniform heavy with water, and pressed forward under machine gun fire. Behind every ridge and bunker, German soldiers waited, but the Channel's storm had left its mark on them too. Mines had shifted, machine guns had jammed, and some observation points were washed out. Harris and the men of his company moved forward, slipping in sand and struggling to lift waterlogged weapons, discovering that even in war, Survival often meant negotiating with forces far older and wilder than men: the sea, the wind, and the rain. By December 1944, the war had returned to Europe in the form of snow and fog in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge was meant to be a swift German strike, a hammer blow that would split Allied forces. Yet the weather was both ally and enemy. Dense fog grounded aircraft, leaving American and British soldiers exposed to sudden attacks. Visibility was measured in meters. Tanks appeared from nothingness, their engines roaring, sending men diving for cover. Corporal Wilson and his squad struggled through the thick trees, rifles slick with condensation, boots sinking into the wet underbrush. Every sound, every snap of a branch, every distant rumble could be fatal. For days, the men moved blindly, surviving through instinct, training, and luck. They learned to read the fog, feel the vibrations of approaching armor, and trust in the sporadic guidance of radio orders that barely cut through static. On the third day, the sky finally cleared, and Allied aircraft swept in with bombs and strafing runs, turning the tide. Soldiers who had felt trapped in a ghostly world of gray and white finally breathed easier, but they understood how precarious the balance had been. A single weather system had protected them and endangered them in equal measure, shaping the course of battle as much as human strategy ever could. Across the globe in the Pacific, typhoons proved that war was not limited to bullets, bombs, or fire. In late 1944, naval fleets faced storms so violent that ships pitched and rolled as though the sea itself sought to devour them. Sailors clung to rails, drenched and exhausted, watching as water tore away supplies, destroyed landing crafts, and threatened to sweep men overboard. On Leyte Gulf, commanders delayed landings, timing their movements with the unpredictable cycles of wind and rain. Officers learned quickly that even the most meticulous plans could be obliterated in minutes by waves that rose higher than any human expectation. Lieutenant Tanaka, aboard a Japanese destroyer, understood this well. He watched as the fleet staggered through a storm, aware that the same weather could protect the Americans or destroy them. The typhoon was impartial. It knew no allegiance, only power. When the skies cleared and battle commenced, the ships and men who had endured the storm were suddenly in a fragile position. Nature had both tempered and tested them, forcing courage, resilience, and adaptation to be as crucial as any tactical maneuver. Even in Italy, weather slowed progress, shaping battles in ways generals could not control. Rain turned hills into quagmires, tanks floundered in mud, artillery bogged down, and soldiers, soaked and weary, struggled to maintain morale. Each step forward was an exercise in patience, each supply run a gamble against nature itself. Soldiers wrote letters home describing endless gray skies, soaked clothing, and the bitter taste of frustration as men and machines alike succumbed to mud and rain. Yet, through it all, they endured, learning that victory was often negotiated with elements far older and more formidable than any human army. Across every theater, weather shaped heroism. A soldier who survived frostbite in Russia remembered the cruelty of wind against frozen skin. Another who struggled through surf and storm at Normandy recalled the terror and triumph of each wave that threatened to sweep him away. Men who navigated fog in the Ardennes understood how fear and uncertainty could be both weapon and shield. Sailors in the Pacific learned that patience in the face of typhoons could save lives, and sometimes ships. Every campaign, every advance, every retreat was colored by the sky, the sea, and the land. By the war's end, soldiers, sailors, and airmen all carried with them an unspoken respect for forces that had no allegiance. Battles were remembered not only for victories or losses, but for the wind that bent trees like kindling, for snow that swallowed men and machines alike, for rain that reduced mountains and hills to impossible quagmires. Weather had been both ally and adversary. shaping the human experience of war in ways that strategy and courage alone could never fully dictate. And in that knowledge, there was a quiet humility, an understanding that even the most brilliant plans could be undone by the simple, unyielding power of nature. Italy in late 1943 was a land of rain-soaked hills and mud-choked roads. The Allies advanced slowly, their progress measured in yards rather than miles. Lieutenant Robert Hayes peered through the mist, his boots sinking into clay that threatened to swallow them whole. Tanks that should have led the way were stalled in quagmires, their engines struggling against the sucking mud. Artillery crews labored under sodden canvas, struggling to keep powder dry, to keep their guns operational. Every step was hard-earned, every hill a battle in itself, as the rain turned the earth against men who had come to conquer it. Hayes's company moved along the Gustav Line, the Germans entrenched in stone bunkers and fortified positions. But it wasn't only enemy fire that slowed them. The weather dictated the pace. Rain made observation impossible. Clouds hung low, and each attempt to move artillery forward felt like negotiating with a stubborn, ancient adversary. Soldiers wrote home about endless gray skies, dripping uniforms, and the ceaseless mud that clung to boots like glue. Nights were particularly cruel. Men huddled together under meager tarps, listening to the patter of rain on canvas roofs, trying to keep warm, wondering how they would survive another day in the endless wet. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the island campaigns demanded a different kind of negotiation with weather. On Leyte, typhoons and sudden storms delayed amphibious landings, turning once firm sandbars into treacherous quagmires. Marines and sailors alike discovered that timing, patience, and adaptability were as critical as firepower. Corporal James Nakamura stood at the edge of a landing craft, watching waves crash over the bow. Each surge of water threatened to sweep men into the swirling depths. Supplies were destroyed, landing crafts swamped, and soldiers' spirits were tested as never before. Yet, when the storm subsided, the landings proceeded with calculated caution. The survivors understood that nature, like war, demanded respect, and that arrogance could be fatal. On some islands, the rains never ceased. Soldiers and civilians alike were soaked to the bone, drinking water from muddy puddles when fresh sources were unavailable. Diseases spread quickly in the wet, humid environment, further decimating units already stretched thin. Typhoons struck without warning, reshaping beaches, wrecking supply lines, and leaving men stranded for days. Yet, in these conditions, the human spirit proved resilient. Soldiers learned to improvise, to build temporary shelters, to ration supplies. Engineers dug drainage channels through the mud. Medics fought fever and dysentery with limited resources. Every day survived felt like a small victory, a testament to endurance in the face of forces far beyond their control. Back in Europe, the Ardennes campaign lingered in memory as a stark example of weather's power. Soldiers recalled the dense fog that had turned forests into ghostly labyrinths, hiding dangers at every turn. Corporal Wilson had survived through instinct and the sound of approaching tanks, learning to move as silently as the fog itself. When the sky finally cleared, the Allies brought overwhelming air power to bear. But the fog had shielded them long enough to regroup, to counterattack, and to survive. Men spoke quietly of that fog for years afterward, remembering how it had been both friend and foe, shaping their choices in ways no commander could predict. Across all theaters, one theme became clear. Victory was not only a matter of strategy or bravery, but of adaptation. Soldiers learned to read the sky, to anticipate the mood of the sea, to understand the rhythms of wind and rain. In Russia, frost and mud had destroyed an army's momentum. In Normandy, wind and tide had dictated the timing of the largest invasion in history. In the Ardennes, fog had both imperiled and protected men in ways no map could show. And in the Pacific, typhoons had tested patience and endurance, teaching men that survival often meant negotiating with forces far older than humanity itself. Even beyond the battlefield, weather shaped decisions at the highest levels of command. Eisenhower had postponed D-Day based on forecasts that predicted storms, a decision that could have doomed the invasion if ignored. Commanders in the Pacific delayed landings, rerouted fleets, and adapted plans to the whims of typhoons. In Russia, German generals miscalculated the severity of winter, leading to catastrophic losses. Each campaign reminded leaders that the elements were as much an opponent as any human army. Yet amid the destruction, human resilience shone. Soldiers endured frostbite, flooding, and suffocating heat. Sailors braved storms, their vessels pitching violently. Marines slogged through mud, their uniforms soaked, their weapons heavy with rain. Each day survived required ingenuity, courage, and endurance. Letters home spoke not only of battles fought against enemies, but against the earth, the sky, and the sea itself. Many soldiers would later say that the hardest opponent in the war was not a soldier across the battlefield, but the weather that challenged them at every turn. By the end of the war, veterans carried with them a quiet reverence for these natural forces. Men who had survived Russia's winter knew the taste of fear in temperatures that could kill without a shot fired. Those who had stormed Normandy remembered every wave, every gust of wind, every cold, wet hour on the beach. In the Ardennes, the fog lingered in memory, a reminder that life could hang in balance for days, unseen yet omnipresent. And in the Pacific, the fury of typhoons had been both a test and a lesson, that adaptability, patience, and humility were as crucial as courage. Weather had shaped every major operation in the war, often with consequences as profound as any general's orders. It had claimed lives, dictated strategy, and forged resilience. Soldiers learned to negotiate with mud, snow, wind, rain, and sea, understanding that survival required more than firepower. It demanded respect, foresight, and flexibility. Each campaign had its own challenges, its own lessons, yet the theme was constant. Nature was an uncompromising adversary, one that demanded acknowledgement in every decision, every advance, every retreat. As veterans returned home, many found it difficult to convey the full impact of weather on the war. Civilians understood battles, guns, and explosions, but few grasped how frostbite, storm tides, mud, or fog had altered the course of history. For the men and women who had lived through it, weather had been a silent partner, shaping their experience as much as any human enemy. Some told stories of frost that crept into their bones, of waves that threatened to swallow them, of mud so deep that tanks could not move. Others spoke of the fog that concealed danger and provided brief reprieves, of typhoons that delayed death or destruction by mere hours. In the end, the war had been fought not only against human enemies but against the natural world itself. Strategy, bravery, and planning had been essential, but the unyielding forces of weather had dictated the rhythm of life and death at every turn. Those who survived carried lessons of endurance, humility, and respect, lessons that remained long after guns fell silent. Even decades later, when veterans of that war walked through winter snow, huddled against rain, or listened to the wind over open fields, they remembered. They remembered the cold that had tested their resolve, the storms that had challenged their courage, the fog that had masked both danger and salvation. They remembered that, in the theater of war, nature had been the most persistent, impartial, and unforgiving commander of all. And so the story of the war remained incomplete without it. The snow, the rain, the mud, the fog, the waves, the typhoons. Weather had written itself into every battle, every hardship, and every victory. A silent and unyielding witness to the courage, resilience, and ingenuity of those who endured its trials. In that recognition, there was understanding that victory required more than strategy or force. It required an alliance, tenuous but necessary, with the forces of the world itself. By the spring of 1945, the war was drawing to a close in Europe, but the memories of frost, fog, and rain lingered in the minds of those who had survived. In villages across France and Belgium, soldiers spoke quietly of the harsh winters, of mud that swallowed men and machines alike, and of sudden storms that had forced advances to halt or battles to pivot. Corporal Wilson, now back in his hometown, often awoke in the night shivering, recalling the fog in the Ardennes, how it had both concealed danger and preserved life. He remembered his squad moving cautiously, relying on instinct rather than sight, learning to trust the vibrations in the earth and the distant roar of engines as guides. The fog had been as much a character in that campaign as any soldier or general, impartial yet shaping the outcome of lives and battles alike. In Normandy, veterans of the beach landings told stories not just of German bunkers or barbed wire, but of the relentless sea and wind that threatened to sweep them into eternity. Private Harris remembered the cold, the waves crashing over the landing craft, the helplessness of men tossed into the channel by forces that could not be commanded or predicted. When he returned home, he would stare at the ocean, feeling again the weight of water and wind, the utter vulnerability of human beings against nature's immense and unfeeling power. For him and countless others, D-Day had been won not only through strategy and courage, but through resilience in the face of elemental fury. In the East, the survivors of the Russian winter carried scars, visible and invisible, from the long months of frost and starvation. Lieutenant Krauss walked slowly through the streets of Berlin years later, remembering the frozen roads, the tanks immobilized by ice, and the men lost to hypothermia. He recalled Sergeant Petrov and his unit moving silently through the snow, not as aggressors, but as soldiers attuned to the rhythm of the land. Nature had been their ally and their adversary, shaping decisions, dictating survival, and ultimately determining the pace of the campaign. The human stories of endurance in Russia were inseparable from the story of the cold itself, a constant reminder that even the most powerful armies could be humbled by frost and snow. Across the Pacific, the sea had proven equally formidable. Marines, sailors, and airmen had confronted typhoons and torrential rain on distant islands, battling not only enemy fire, but the violent rhythms of nature. Corporal Nakamura remembered the chaos of waves higher than landing crafts, of supplies and men swept into the ocean, of hours spent clinging to rails, drenched and exhausted. Every landing, every advance, required an understanding of the weather's temperament. The islands, lush and beautiful, hid death in their storms, and victory often depended on the patience to wait for the lull between tempests. Those who survived learned lessons that would remain with them for life, that courage without adaptability was folly, and that humility before nature was as crucial as bravery in battle. Even in Italy, the muddy hills had tested endurance in ways that maps and strategy could not anticipate. Lieutenant Hayes remembered the endless drizzle, the clay that pulled at every boot, the artillery that jammed under sodden tarps. Men had been lost to exhaustion as much as to gunfire, and survival required teamwork, ingenuity, and a constant negotiation with the land itself. Rain had slowed the fastest advances, shifted the outcomes of engagements, and demanded improvisation at every turn. The soldiers learned that in war, victory was rarely absolute, and was often measured in small, hard-won inches of terrain, gained against both enemy and weather as the years passed. Veterans reflected on the universality of these experiences. Frost, wind, rain, mud, fog, and waves were forces that transcended nationality, rank, and theater. They had humbled generals, tested soldiers, and shaped the trajectory of campaigns across continents. The men and women who survived came to understand that war was not fought solely against human opponents. It was fought in partnership and in conflict with the elements themselves. Nature was impartial, relentless, and often merciless, but it also offered moments of reprieve, concealment, and opportunity. If only one could read its signals and endure its trials. For historians, the statistics of battles often overshadowed the human experience of weather. The frozen corpses in Russia, the drowned soldiers in Normandy, the immobilized tanks in Italy, the stranded men in the Pacific storms. Yet for those who lived it, weather was as vivid and memorable as the sound of gunfire or the smell of smoke. Frostbite, mud, storm tides, and fog were not just obstacles. They were co-authors of history, shaping heroism and tragedy in equal measure. Soldiers would recall the feeling of wet socks freezing to boots, of winds slicing across exposed skin, of waves tossing landing crafts, of mud swallowing wheels and men alike. These were the adversaries that could neither be negotiated with weapons nor bypassed with strategy, only endured, respected, and survived. In the end, the story of weather in World War II was inseparable from the story of humanity itself. It highlighted resilience, resourcefulness, and courage in the face of circumstances beyond control. From the bitter winters of Russia to the storm-lashed shores of the Pacific, from the foggy forests of the Ardennes to the rain-slick hills of Italy, men and women endured, adapted, and persevered. The elements demanded attention, shaped decisions, and dictated survival, leaving an indelible mark on every campaign. Even decades later, the veterans remembered. They spoke quietly of frost, fog, rain, and storm, of the exhaustion and fear, of the ingenuity required to survive. They spoke of comrades lost not to bullets, but to mud, ice, or waves. They spoke of small victories over the weather itself. A tank freed from mud, a landing made despite waves, a march continued despite frost. In every story, in every memory, the elements were present as silent witnesses, shaping outcomes and human experience alike. And perhaps, above all, the veterans learned humility. No matter the strategy, no matter the courage or firepower, nature had the final word. Snow could stall an army, fog could conceal life or death, rain could halt artillery, and storms could scatter fleets. Yet those who endured understood a profound truth. Survival, adaptation, and respect for forces greater than themselves were as critical to victory as any gun or plan. The war had ended, but the lessons endured. Frost, mud, fog, rain, and storm had tested humanity at every turn, revealing courage, endurance, and ingenuity in its harshest forms. Soldiers returned home forever changed, carrying memories not only of battles fought, but of the elements they had confronted, endured, and survived. Nature had been a constant, impartial partner in war, shaping history in ways as profound as strategy or bravery, and leaving a legacy of resilience that would resonate for generations. In quiet moments, veterans would remember the cold, the mud, the rain, the fog, and the waves, and in that remembrance, they understood something essential. The story of war was never complete without the weather. It had shaped the battlefield, tested the human spirit, and claimed as many lives as any army. And in that recognition, there was wisdom, humility, and a deep respect for the unyielding power of the natural world. Forces as relentless as the human will and as enduring as history itself. Even after the guns fell silent, even after victory was declared on distant beaches, frozen plains, and storm-lashed islands, the memory of the weather lingered. Soldiers who had survived carried it with them, not as a simple recollection of hardship, but as a reminder of forces greater than themselves. Frost-bitten fingers, mud-choked boots, waves that threatened to swallow landing crafts, fog that masked life and death, all remained vivid in the mind long after the battles had ended. Generals and historians would tally victories, losses, and strategic maneuvers, But the men and women who had endured the war knew that the weather had been as decisive as any plan. A frozen river could halt an army. A storm could delay an invasion by hours, changing the course of history. Fog could conceal a retreat or an ambush, and mud could slow the mightiest tanks to a crawl. Across every theater, from the frozen forests of Russia to the rain-slick hills of Italy, from Normandy's violent surf to the typhoon-tossed Pacific Islands, nature had been both adversary and ally. Impartial, yet relentless. Yet, through it all, humanity endured. Soldiers improvised, adapted, and persevered. They learned patience in the face of storms, humility in the face of frost, and ingenuity when mud or fog seemed insurmountable. Each small victory, crossing a frozen river, securing a muddy hill, landing a troop safely on a storm-tossed beach, was a testament to courage and resilience. These were not victories of strategy alone, but of endurance against the raw, untamed power of the natural world. In reflecting on the war, veterans often spoke quietly of the lessons the weather had taught them. They understood that human determination could bend many things, but some forces demanded respect. The sky, the sea, the land, they were constant, impartial witnesses to human struggle, shaping every decision and every survival. In the quiet of their later years, walking through snow, rain, or fog, they would remember not only the comrades lost to bullets, but also those claimed by frost, drowning, or exhaustion, and in that memory lay wisdom. The war had been fought against human enemies, but it had also been fought with nature itself. Victory required more than courage, firepower, or cunning. It demanded adaptability, resilience, and an understanding of forces far older and more enduring than any human army. Frost, rain, mud, fog, and storm were silent partners in every campaign, shaping history as profoundly as strategy, and teaching humanity lessons that no textbook could ever fully capture. Ultimately, the story of World War II is incomplete without acknowledging the weather that shaped it. It was not merely a backdrop, but a force that tested men and women, forged resilience, and altered the course of history. Those who survived carried that knowledge forward, a quiet reverence for the unyielding power of nature and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The war had ended, but the memory of frostbite, mud, fog, storm, and rain remained. A reminder that the greatest battles were often fought not just against other humans, but against the world itself. And so, long after the guns were silenced and the armies disbanded, the lessons endured. That courage and strategy are indispensable, but so too is respect for the winds, waters, and winters that shape every human endeavor. In surviving them, humanity proved that resilience, adaptation, and humility could turn even nature's fiercest trials into a story of endurance, heroism, and ultimately, hope.